Hello class, and welcome to Lecture 19 of Philosophy 205. In this lecture, we continue our discussion of the mind by considering functionalism, which is a theory that relates the mind to function. But how does it do it? The question we're asking is this: can we explain the mind without describing what it is made of? If you think back to dualism, dualism claimed that there was a special mental substance that was completely separate from the physical, and that's what the mind was. Mind-brain identity theory said that the mind was inherently physical. In particular, any mental state type was identical to a physical state type. Both of those theories try to describe the mind by saying what it's made of. But can we get away from this question, exactly what is the mind made of, and describe the mental in other terms? Is the key to understanding the mind not in what it's made of? Functionalism is a theory that claims the essence of the mind is not what it's made of. Functionalism claims that psychological states are defined by their functional role, and it does not matter what carries out that role. To give you an example of what we're talking about, functionalism says that a state like believing there is a tiger is defined by its function, which is to make you act like there is a tiger. And this is how we can identify different mental states. So wanting water is a state that has the function of making you move toward water to try to get it. Now we should clarify that beliefs and desires function together. They function together to make you act in ways you believe will achieve your desires. Now at this point, you might be thinking this is very similar to behaviorism. Isn't this just the same thing as behaviorism? And it isn't. So here's the main difference. Behaviorism was trying to avoid beliefs and desires altogether, that we shouldn't believe that there's anything inside the mind that explains what we're doing. There's just input-output. Functionalism, on the other hand, says that beliefs and desires exist. There really are inner states. They're inner states that explain what people do. Functionalism is just trying to say that what defines those inner states is how they function. So it doesn't try to eliminate beliefs and desires. It's trying to explain what they do. All right. But this is what the theory is. Is there any reason to think it's true? Well, first of all, one proposed benefit of functionalism is that it captures multiple realizability. So multiple realizability refers to when many physical ways exist to perform the same function. Think of things that are defined by their function. For example, a mousetrap. In order to be a mousetrap, the only requirement you have to meet is that you're designed to trap mice. So the classic spring trap is a mousetrap. It uses a wood base with wires and springs in order to trap mice. However, the glue trap is also a mousetrap, even though it has no moving parts and is just made of plastic and adhesive. So in order to qualify as a mousetrap, it doesn't matter what you're made of. All that matters is that you trap mice. Now, how does this relate to the mind? There's reason to think that the mind could be multiply realizable. For example, different species have different brains. And different people might have different ways of doing the same things. So if it turns out that there are intelligent aliens in the world, I shouldn't have said in the world, I should have said in the universe. If there are intelligent aliens in the universe, it seems like they will be able to have the same beliefs we do. An alien could believe that snow is white, just the same way we can believe that snow is white. But we have every reason to think if there are aliens, their brains will realize that belief differently. The way their brain allows them to believe that snow is white will be completely different from how our brains allow us to do that. And yet, it seems like we should be able to say an alien can believe that snow is white. Furthermore, if we restrict ourselves to Earth, it seems like humans and other animals can experience pain. Pain is a mental state. Do we have any reason to think that the nervous system of humans experiences pain the exact same way the nervous system of other animals does? It seems extremely possible that different nervous systems might realize pain differently. And furthermore, probably all of us believe that there was a hurricane that hit Texas earlier this year. But is there any reason to think that that is encoded in all of our brains exactly the same way? There's reason to think it probably isn't. Yet, so somehow we can all have that belief, and yet it probably isn't encoded the same way in all of our brains. This suggests that the mind is multiply realizable. We have reason to think that mental states like believing there was a hurricane in Texas, or states like being in pain, can be realized different ways. So this would refute mind-brain identity theory. If there's more than one way to believe that there was a hurricane in Texas, then identity theory can't be right. But if beliefs are identified in terms of their function, it doesn't matter how they're implemented. All that matters is what function they have. So functionalism makes sense of how the mind can be multiply realizable, how different brains can do different things. We go even further. Think about computers. Could a computer ever be conscious? Probably a lot of you think that computers can be. I suspect that computers could be conscious someday. I don't think any computer now is, but it seems like a possibility. But if computers could ever be conscious, then it seems like the mind has to be multiply realizable. Computers are realized by semiconductor circuits involving silicon and other elements, whereas the human brain is not. It is made up of neurons, made of carbon. So if a computer can ever have a mind, it's going to have to be a completely different system than the human brain. So the mind will be realized by a completely different system. And yet it makes sense to think computers maybe could be conscious someday. Furthermore, we can look at the Turing test. If you're familiar with the Turing test, Turing proposed that if you want to know whether a computer has a mind, here's how you test it. You have somebody interact with the computer, and if after long enough they still can't tell whether they're interacting with a human or a computer, then the computer has a mind. We can conclude from this that the computer has a mind. So the idea is you can prove that something has a mind by showing functional equivalence. Because think about what this test is doing. It's trying to figure out, can you tell the difference between human responses and computer responses? Another way to put that is you're trying to tell whether the computer functions differently from the human. And it claims that if you can show that there's a functional equivalence, then you've shown that they both have minds. So this test basically assumes that the mind is purely functional. And a lot of people have been somewhat persuaded by this idea that the Turing test can prove whether something has a mind. Of course, the Turing test by itself as a proof of having a mind is somewhat controversial. But to the extent that it is plausible at all, it's evidence in favor of functionalism. Now let's look at psychology and the way psychologists practice science. In the psychological sciences, psychologists appeal to internal states for explanations. But for many, many experiments, the implementation of those internal states doesn't matter. If you read the psychological literature about biases, they almost never refer to the brain. They refer to the results of experiments and the kinds of mental states that they're evidence for. So they put people in various situations, measure their reactions, and they realize, oh, this person has a certain kind of bias. Now, this bias is purely functional. All the psychologist has done is measured how this person functions given this task. The psychologist didn't go into their brain and figure out what their brain was doing. So it seems like psychological science can do very well. Psychologists have come up with very robust experimental results that have been verified over and over and over without having to reduce everything to the brain state. So it seems like defining mental states by their function works very well in psychological science. And who are we to question a successful science? So that's another way you can argue in favor of functionalism. So one example is you can explain why somebody jumps to conclusions about people they meet by claiming that they have a belief in stereotypes. So if someone automatically assumes that British people are going to walk around wearing top hats, we can explain why they make that assumption based on a belief in a stereotype. And so this belief is identified functionally. We've never actually figured out exactly what it is in their brain or whether they have a non-physical mind that does this or that. We just know that they tend to make this assumption. So we claim that there's this functional state that has the function of leading to this conclusion. For a lot of reasons, it looks like the way we deal with the mind normally is by its function. All right, so those are reasons to think functionalism is true. Are there objections to the theory? As you might expect, since it's a philosophical theory, yes, there are objections. There are reasons to think that it doesn't quite work. One of the main problems with it is pain. Think about what function pain has. If you tried to define pain functionally, do you think you could do it? Well, if you had to describe the function of pain, it seems like it has an avoidance function. Something like that. That pain overall has the function of making you avoid the things that are painful. Of course, this can be overridden in certain circumstances, but in general, that's the function of pain. However, even if we could fully describe the function of pain, it seems like pain itself is more than this. There seems to be an experience beyond the function of pain. That fundamentally, what it means to be in pain is to be having a certain kind of experience. There's something it feels like to be in pain, and that feeling is over and above its function. Even if pain had no function at all, there's still that experience of what it's like to be in pain. It doesn't seem like we can fully explain pain just in terms of the function that it has, the kinds of things that it makes us do combined with different kinds of beliefs and desires. So the functionalist can explain things like masochism by saying, well, certain people want to experience pain and that overcomes the normal function of pain, and so with their beliefs and desires, blah, 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 blah. So masochism isn't a problem for functionalism. But even then, functionalists are only describing how pain combines with other beliefs and desires somebody has. It doesn't capture the experience of what it's like to be in pain. That seems like a problem. Functionalism also runs into problems with things like false beliefs. For example, suppose that you see a horse, but you think it's a large shrub. What you're actually looking at is a horse, but when you look at it, you think, well, that's a big shrub over there. Now, how does the function of your belief relate to horses? How does it relate to shrubs? So according to functionalism, you believe it's a shrub. So the function of your belief has something to do with shrubs. But in this case, what you're actually looking at is a horse. So say you wanted to clip a branch off of a shrub for some reason. You really wanted to clip a branch off of a shrub. So the function of that belief would be to make you go towards a horse. This doesn't actually bring you closer to your goal. And so it seems like the actual function of your belief that that's a shrub can't be explained in terms of shrubs. So what is your belief actually about? Can we actually say that your belief is about shrubs? It's hard to say. It's very difficult to explain. If we eliminate all reference to beliefs and just try to say, what's the function of this mental state? It's very hard to do it. It's very hard to explain how this can be a belief about shrubs. Okay. There's a related problem with desires. So if you fail to get what you want, or you do something that you didn't intend to do, then what desires did you actually have? So just like beliefs, functionalism says desires are defined by their function. So if you want something, you're in a state whose function is to get you to the thing you want. But what happens when you fail? Can we really say that the state you were in has the function of getting you to what you want? If you screw up and do something you didn't mean to do, can we say that what you wanted to do actually had the function of getting you where you wanted to be? So as an example, suppose you tried to hit a target. We can say you wanted to hit the target, you intended to hit the target. You can use all of this language about your mental state involving wanting to hit that target. But suppose instead of hitting the target, you hit your friend instead. So before you threw the dart, you were in a mental state that led you to throw a dart and hit your friend. So that's what the mental state actually did. The mental state caused you to throw a dart at your friend. So what function did your desire have? I mean, we want to say that your desire, the function of your desire, well, we want to say that your desire was about hitting the target. That's what your desire was. But did it actually have that function? So it's really hard to figure out what exactly is the function of a mental state, what's the function of a desire when things can go wrong. Now, functionalism might have a response to this. And it's not a detailed response, but it's a partial response, and it points in the direction where we want to go and kind of dissolves the problem. So the response is something like this. For everything else that has a function, we also have the concept of a malfunction. So you can have a mousetrap that doesn't actually trap any mice because something is wrong with it. Maybe the spring is too loose, so it doesn't actually snap shut. We can still make sense of that being a mousetrap even if it doesn't work. In the same way, if we believe that beliefs and desires are defined by their function, then we have to allow that sometimes they can malfunction. And while it might be difficult to explain without referencing other beliefs or other desires what the function of a particular belief is, there you have it. All right, so that's a possible response. That the existence of a function implies the possibility of malfunction, and so cases like this might not be a problem. Now let's come back to something I brought up at the beginning. How does this compare to identity theory? And in particular, how does it relate to materialism? I mentioned that materialism has motivated some of the theories we've considered, in particular behaviorism and mind-brain identity theory. A lot of philosophers and a lot of scientists look at the success of the physical sciences and think, this seems like the way to go. It really looks like everything is material because we do so well in science when we deal with material things, and we seem to get nowhere when we're trying to deal with immaterial things. So if we're motivated by materialism, or if somebody is, can functionalism be consistent with that? On the other hand, does functionalism force you to be a materialist? if you believe functionalism is true, does that mean you have to believe materialism is true? So let's take a look. Again, materialism is the view that everything that exists is physical. The question is functionalism consistent with this view? And the related question, does materialism or does functionalism imply materialism? So it turns out that functionalism is consistent with materialism. The reason it is because, according to functionalism, every mental state is defined by its function, but it doesn't matter what carries out the function. So as long as something physical carries out the function of a belief, then beliefs exist. As long as physical things can carry out the function of a mind, then minds can exist and materialism can be true. So functionalism allows minds to exist in a purely material world. It doesn't say that any particular physical state type is identical to any mental state type. All it says is there has to be some physical thing that carries out the function. On the other hand, being a functionalist doesn't force you to be a materialist. Because again, all that matters is something is carrying out the function. So there could be a non-material soul that's carrying out the function of a mind. And as long as something is carrying out that function, that's all that functionalism cares about. So you can be a functionalist and believe that everything that exists is physical, or you can be a functionalist and believe that there are non-physical things. You can be a functionalist and believe that there's no material world at all. So that makes it somewhat more flexible, which to some extent makes it a more attractive theory. Now, to compare it to mind-brain identity theory, let's go back to the distinction between token and type. As you recall, here on the screen, there's one type of letter, but two tokens. So they're the same type of letter, but different tokens. A type is a repeatable form, whereas a token is an instance of a form. So if we want a materialist version of functionalism would say that mental state tokens are identical to physical state tokens. According to functionalism, if you believe that snow is white, there is some physical state. Well, if you're a materialist functionalist, when someone believes that snow is white, according to a materialist functionalist, there's some physical state that realizes that mental state. But if somebody else believes that snow is white, it doesn't have to be the same physical state. So every time somebody believes snow is white, there's some physical thing that allows them to believe that. Some physical state realizes the mental state, but it's not always the same one. So we can't say that a physical state type or a mental state type is identical to any physical state type, because there can be a bunch of different physical state types that realize a single mental state. But each instance of the mental state has a physical state associated with it. So mental state types are not identical to physical state types. Which means the difference between identity theory and functionalism is that according to identity theory, each mental state type is a physical state type. Whereas materialist functionalism only says each mental token is a physical token. So according to materialist functionalism, mental state types can be realized by tokens of many different physical state types. So just to give one example, if we ever make sentient computers, then the belief that snow is white can be realized by a particular brain state in a human and by a state of a microchip in a computer. And so it's the same mental state, the same belief, but it's realized by different physical states. All right. So to summarize functionalism, functionalism identifies mental states with functions. It can affirm materialism without relying on type identity. But does it capture subjective experience? That's the main issue here. It seems to be a much more flexible theory By only referring to functions and not what carries out the functions, it's consistent with a lot of different views about what exists in the world. But by relating all mental states purely to functions, it seems to leave out the experiential component. It seems to leave out what it's like to experience a mental state. And that could be a significant problem. All right, do you have any idea how you might get around that problem? That's something to think about.